Hello, and welcome to Books from Your Therapist, a podcast where we talk to therapists and mental health practitioners about their mental health related book recommendations. By mixing book talk with mental health, we hope to open up the conversation around books your therapist may have suggested and make them more accessible.
This podcast is not a substitute for mental health care. It's for educational and entertainment purposes only. I'm Amanda Throckmorton, a marriage and family therapist in California.
And I'm Tara Kremen, and I work in the book industry in Toronto, in Canada. In this episode, we're talking to licensed mental health counselor Jonah Bayer. We talked to Jonah about his career transition, moving from music journalism to now working in the mental health field. And the books that we talked about are The Power of Now, A Guide to Spiritual Enlightenment by Eckhart Tolle, and Band People, Life and Work in Popular Music by Franz Nicolay.
The Power of Now by Eckhart Tolle is a spiritual self-help book that emphasizes the importance of living in the present moment to achieve inner peace and enlightenment. The book suggests that much of human suffering stems from dwelling on the past or worrying about the future, and that by focusing on the now, we can transcend those negative emotions and connect with their true self.
Band People offers a close look at the lives of working musicians who aren't the center of their stage. Through interviews and incisive cultural critique, writer and musician Franz Nicolay provides a portrait of the musical middle class. Artists talk frankly about their careers and attitudes toward their craft, work environment, and group dynamics, and shed light on how support musicians make sense of the weird combination of a friend group, gang, small business consortium, long-term creative collaboration, and chosen family that constitutes a band. We had a really great conversation with Jonah. Had a lot of fun. I mean, I could just talk the music talk all day long. It was very, very fun, but also to see how he has used the power of now to influence his therapeutic work.
Hello, Jonah. Welcome to Books from Your Therapist.
Hi, thank you for having me.
We thought we would just sort of start out with an intro about you, like any parts of your identity you'd like to share with the audience.
My name is Jonah Bayer. I am a licensed mental health counselor in Massachusetts, where I work here as a therapist. At a college, I also have a private practice, and I also co-host a podcast called How Did We Get Weird? That's about nostalgia with my sister Vanessa, who is a former cast member on Saturday Night Live, and I've been a longtime music journalist as well. So I write a lot about the intersection of music and mental health, and that's where my practice focuses, and that's something I'm just super interested in and hope we can get into today, which I think we will.
Yeah, that's how I kind of connected with you is I found an article that you had written about Scott Hutchinson from Frightened Rabbit, and it kind of outlined a little bit of your background with music journalism moving into therapy. So could you talk a little bit about how you kind of pivoted your career?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, so worked in music journalism for a long time. In the early 2000s, I was a music editor at this magazine, Alternative Press, and so I'd work on the Warped Tour, and we were kind of part of that whole kind of punk and emo movement in the early 2000s. I was a big part of that, and that was what I wrote about for a long time. I also played in a band called United Nations. I was kind of connected to that world. And then I moved out to this area around 2018 to Western Massachusetts from Brooklyn, and was just really struggling with figuring out what I wanted to do with my career. It was really tough to make a living as a music journalist. A lot of the magazines I was writing for were going out of business, and people were leaving. And as you know, kind of in the publishing industry, like you have a contact you write for and then they leave, and then all of a sudden you're sort of like, you don't really have a connection. You can't really work for them anymore. So I wanted to pivot into something else, and I felt like mental health was something so many of the artists I was interviewing were talking about. And it felt like a therapeutic interview had some traits similar to a journalistic interview. And so I was just started looking into it, and I also couldn't find a therapist out here. It was all wait lists. So I was like, this is something people need. I'm kind of tired about writing about the same bands over and over anyways. And so I went back to school in 2019 to Antioch University. I got a master's degree in clinical mental health counseling, and then I worked in community mental health for a few years as I got my postgraduate hours, and just got licensed actually in April.
Well, congratulations. I hope it's been
Thank
going
you.
well so
Yeah,
Ah,
far. Yeah.
thanks. Yeah,
that's
and so
huge.
yeah, so it was a lot of hours, a lot of time. It took me about 5.5 years, including the summers, and yeah, and in the meantime, I kind of kept up writing about music, like the article you saw, but a lot of it is focused on kind of mental health, and that kind of intersection is kind of much more interesting to me than just like what does this new record sound like.
That article, I just found it really moving because if people aren't familiar with Frightened Rabbit or this Scottish band that I've always loved and have seen them a bunch of times, and then they played I think it was maybe the 10th anniversary of the Midnight Organ Fight, and saw that in Toronto. I actually didn't get a ticket, and my friend got one and knew that it was my favorite album and gave me the ticket, which am forever
Wow.
grateful about because that was in February and then Scott passed away in May. And that was, you talk about, or I mean, people talk about celebrity deaths or musician deaths, and sometimes it can be, I don't know. It was one that I've just found, it just really hit me hard. And mostly because of like his lyrics, I guess, and kind of like the means of how he sort of passed away. And, music can be an outlet for tough emotions. His lyrics were like extremely vulnerable. And you mentioned a little bit your interest between the intersection of music and mental health. So can you chat a little bit about this and what that means to you?
Yeah, absolutely. Scott was someone who's really influential on me as well. I did not know him super well. I mean, I was like you, was a huge fan of the band, and then I had him on my old podcast. We got to do it in person in Brooklyn. That's where that photo was from, and then I got to see him on that Midnight Organ Flight 10th anniversary in New York, and he put me on the list for the show, and I got to say hi afterwards, and yeah, just I think he was just such an amazingly talented guy and just such an amazing songwriter. And I think those songs, for like, eternity on, people will be like discovering Frightened Rabbit. And I think they're one of those bands that people will just always love. But yeah, I think he obviously had sort of these, vulnerabilities and issues. And I think he was really good at putting them into writing. I think that can be really cathartic for people. And when he passed away, I was really, like I said, I didn't know, him on a personal level. And it really was so sad. And it was just such a huge loss. And it's one of the things that kind of made me want to pivot into this career. Like, I think I was already thinking about it, but I think seeing this happen, I was like, okay, I've been in this world of music for a long time. Maybe I can help people who are going through difficult kind of mental health issues. And I think that kind of really influenced my decision to do it just because I feel like you'd want to prevent that from happening to anyone. And it's just, yeah, it was just seemed so, yeah, it was just such a huge loss. I was just such a big fan, obviously, like you. And when I did the podcast with Scott, we talked about this perception, maybe like, oh, do people assume you're this really melancholy person because of the lyrics can be so sad? And he said, people use me as a therapist. And the podcast, and I think people really connected with him. We put a lot of that on him. And from my experience as a personality, he was a kind of like a funny, really outgoing person. I think there was that kind of dichotomy there.
It's so interesting to hear about this because as we're speaking, I'm like, this makes so much sense in terms of like something you would focus on in your clinical work. Because I think, a lot of people would probably agree that music evokes a lot within you and it helps you understand things about your own life. And I don't know, it's such a therapeutic tool. But you're the first person I've actually met that centers their work on working with musicians. Can you just talk a little bit more about that? I'm so curious, like, what is a client for you and how is like music play a part in your clinical work in any way?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's really interesting because there is sort of this like, tortured artist kind of archetype, right? And so there's obviously a lot of substance abuse, a lot of kind of, debaucherous behavior. Like this is kind of part of like what people expect from musicians or maybe what they think they need to do in order to make this compelling art. And I don't think that's necessarily true. And so from my perspective, I have a book project as well on Microcosm Press that's about band therapy, mental health for musicians. To me, what I try to really focus on when I'm working with an artist or a creative group is communication, effective communication. So
Mm.
much of it so many of the issues I think with artists can be alleviated by just learning how to talk to each other. But I feel like that's not a skill that's really taught. And I think especially when the band is young men, they're especially bad at that. So I think that's a big one. I think showing that you don't need to sort of deal with substances or have these sort of follow these kind of stories in order to have your art be powerful. And I also think just, yeah, how can you use it as a catharsis? How can you use the music as a tool to get these emotions out, instead of sort of keeping them inside?
Wow, like that makes a lot of sense to think about, yeah, breaking it down into maybe some like group dynamics and teaching a lot of basic communication skills, which I think all of us at some point need to learn. But also you throw in the close proximity of a band and passions in everyone's own, ambition in that. So I think that's really cool work. It's like fun to hear that you're doing it because like I said, you're the first person I've met that's like that focuses on that, and what a cool intersect of your passions and interests.
Thanks. Yeah, thanks so much. And it's like part of the book is my own experiences. Like, it starts out, I was in a band 20 years ago and a member punched another member in the head when we were on tour and they called the cops and we had to, it's just like all of these things that happened. And I was kind of standing there being like, I don't know what to do. I'm like,
Mm.
22 years old. So now I'm like 45 years old. I'm like, okay, I think I would know what to do now. How can I kind of put that out into the world maybe so these things aren't really happening as much or bands can sort of deal with these situations without like punching each other in the head essentially.
Yeah, I'm so curious about the book. So can you tell us a little bit more about what the book is focusing on? Is it sort of like a how-to? Is it a mental health related book? I'm like, ooh, tell me more.
Yeah, so Microcosm does a lot of these kind of almost, I wouldn't call it like a workbook, but I think it has, you don't write in it, but it has exercises that you can do with your bandmates. I'm really influenced by ACT, acceptance and commitment therapy. A lot of that is about moving towards values. So a lot of it is finding collective values. And then some stuff I took from DBT because I've taught DBT groups, and a lot of that is about emotional regulation, interpersonal effectiveness, distress tolerance. So it's really taking those ideas and putting them in the band context. But a lot of it is focusing on effective communication skills. How can people talk to each other, especially when it comes to the idea of creative collaboration, and people's egos are involved, and how do you just kind of set some guidelines so that there aren't all this resentment, there isn't fighting, things are more transparent. And I think that can really help the longevity of the band for sure. And I think it would have helped the longevity of my bands and a lot of my friends' bands if they had some kind of tool instead of just arguing or keeping stuff kind of bottled up and then exploding on each other. And you see this like all the time, right? You saw like this Jane's Addiction thing where like Perry Farrell punched Dave Navarro on stage. Now they're suing each other.
Mhm.
It's like these are like adults. These are people in their 50s or 60s. So it's like if you don't learn these skills, these things are going to keep coming up. And almost the more successful you are, the more kind of explosive it can be because it's just like there's so much more pressure. You have a crew, you have money, and so yeah, it's I think it would be beneficial to smaller bands as well as larger bands.
Yeah, think of all the great bands that would have stayed together if they would have had a workbook like this.
Yeah, I know. It's crazy. Yeah, imagine like if the Beatles had stayed together. I mean, like
I
who
was
knows,
literally going to
right?
say the Beatles. I was just
I
like,
know.
yeah, we just give them the book.
It's crazy. And yeah, so it's like, yeah, I'm not like making any claims like if you read this, like everything will
Right.
magically transform your life. But I do think some of these therapeutic skills that we teach our clients can be applied in the context of bands or other kind of creative collaborations. And again, I think it's all like trust and communication. Like those are the big things, but these things are not things that are necessarily taught to you.
Can I ask you about the writing process for the book?
Sure.
Has it been more difficult than, I mean, you're a writer, but journalism is so different. How have you found writing something more long form?
Yeah, it's been, challenging for me. I mean, I'm sort of lucky in the sense that I work at an institution, so I have a 10-month contract, so I have summers. I have a lot more time to kind of focus on it, and that's what I've been doing. And my wife is also a writer, and she's working on a book project, so we're able to kind of help each other. But yeah, I try to just kind of chip away at it. Like I try to just write maybe 500 or 1,000 words a day and then kind of go back at the end. And then I've gotten some books from the press to get a sense of their tone. And I also just read a lot in general. So I feel like if I'm reading something, I'll kind of like highlight it and come back to it later if I think it could be something I could use in the book. But yeah, just trying to make a little bit of time each day, I feel like is more effective to me than trying to write like 5 hours straight or something because I that's yeah, it gets a little intense. I don't know. What about you two? What's your process like?
Oh, I wouldn't call myself a writer at all, but from the writers that I work, it's all different.
Yeah.
And like some that work right up to the deadline, and
Hmm.
it's the plotter versus the pantser sort of idea. But yeah, I don't know. I think it would be very hard to imagine writing an entire book. I think the way that you break it down by 500,000 words a day, makes it a little bit more achievable.
Yeah, I mean, my understanding, like with any kind of contemplative practice too, like whether it's yoga or meditation or writing, is like having that kind of consistent and not necessarily like putting in the most time at once, but making it kind of part of your routine and just trying to do a little bit a day seems to be like the most effective way.
It's also interesting to think about it in terms of like, this is really an experiential time for you while you're writing this, right? Like you have clinical, I imagine you have clinical work going on
Hmm.
alongside writing this. It's like, that's pretty cool to think about in terms of like, submerging yourself in really learning by working with people or dynamics and then being able to take that and then directly apply it to something you're trying to create.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the clinical work definitely like has informed the book and then just all of the time I've spent on the road and just witnessing this kind of dysfunction. And yeah, so I feel like I have my feet in both those worlds. So it's nice to kind of bring them together in a way.
You have quite a lot going on in terms of like clinical work, writing a book. You have a podcast with your sister Vanessa. Anything else that you want to share, either that you're up to or anything just about you professionally or personally before we jump into your first book?
Yeah, so I do the podcast with Vanessa. How do we get weird? That comes out every Monday on the All Things Comedy Network. I am accepting private practice clients for telehealth in Massachusetts. I'm only licensed in Massachusetts. But for bands outside of Massachusetts, I'm also doing a coaching program where I'm helping with some of the skills in the book, called Quiet Storm Coaching. And all this info is on my website. And I also have a band, United Nations, and we haven't put anything out in a very long time. But all of the music, the Bandcamp links are on my site. So that's basically everything, I think.
When do you rest? That's a lot.
Yeah, it's a lot. It kind of like one thing will take over and then it'll go in the background. And some things are just kind of like the podcast is just a few hours a week. So you just yeah, it kind of balances out. But yeah, a lot of times I'm at work and then I just come home and have to kind of work on something else. So trying to prioritize like my self-care and all that stuff can get tricky sometimes. But right now it's great. So I'm just trying to also enjoy the time when I'm not super busy.
And then if there's a listener who's in a band and is curious about working with you, I guess a question I have is, is it like mainly individual work with a person in a band, or is it more like group work? Just sort of curious in terms of would the coaching program be centered on the band or individual?
Yeah, so both are options, and I'm sort of building out the coaching company now. I did a business accelerator program out here, and they gave me, I interviewed a lot of managers of bands about like what do your band struggle with, what kind of services would you want, and most of them seem to want group group coaching on telehealth. So that's sort of what I started out. I'm putting together a program that's kind of individualized for the band, but I think if a musician want to do it individual, not everyone is a collaborator in that way. That's also something that I could work with. And I'm working on kind of putting together a program, that would be 4 to 5 weeks where we meet every week and have different kind of goals based on sort of what the band needs to work on. So they could just email me and, I put together something and see if it would work.
Cool. I love this. It's exciting to hear this. Like it honestly is really cool to hear. So Thank you for sharing all of that.
Of course, thank you so much for letting me talk about it. I really appreciate it.
Should we jump into your first book pick, The Power of Now by Eckhart Tolle?
Sure, yeah, that would be great.
So this is sort of a classic book. Why
Yes.
did you choose this one to talk about today?
This has just been such an influential book for me when it comes to like my own life, my therapeutic practice, just the way I move through the world. And yeah, it's just really interesting. My wife, when we were started dating, was a big fan of his Eckhart Tolle, and so she had me read it, and it was like really weird. I was at my sister's apartment, and my sister just had it like on her bookshelf, and I was like, "What is this book?" And she was like, "I don't know. Someone gave it to me." And so I borrowed it and I read it and really, yeah, just really connected with the ideas. I've seen Eckhart Tolle speak live. Like we went to a retreat a year or two ago in Norway where he spoke like every day. I just think he's like really the real deal, and his teachings are really simple. And I like the fact that like he's only really written two books. Like he's not one of these people that's like I think trying to really like make a lot of money or capitalize on this stuff. I just think his ideas are really effective, and he has a really good way of explaining them in an easy to understand way.
How was seeing him live? Because I read this book a while ago, and then this time I listened to it.
Hmm.
So and I've heard his recordings and seen him speak and stuff, but I'm so curious, like how it was to see him in person.
Yeah, it's like really amazing, and it's great you listen to it. The audiobook versions to me are also so amazing because I feel like you can just kind of Power Now or a New Earth, you can kind of just jump in anywhere. I feel like he's so funny. Like he has this really amazing sense of humor, and then the other thing is, he takes these very long pauses. So if you see him live, it's like he'll kind of just sit there and kind of stare, and it's really interesting because he's being really present. Like you can tell he's just kind of like taking it in and being present, and then he'll just talk, and it's like not scripted, and he'll talk for like an hour and a half, and or he'll take questions, and it was him and his partner Kim, and so they would kind of trade off, and yeah, it's really amazing. And a couple times we were able to get like sit very close, and just yeah, just he's just super present. He's really funny. He had yeah, it's really amazing. If you ever get a chance to see him speak, it's totally worth it.
This is great. It's like maybe this is a case where you do want to meet your heroes, you know?
Yeah, yeah, it's interesting. Yeah, I've never met him, but definitely like I feel like he would be a really interesting person to actually like sit down and talk to like on a podcast or outside the context of that because yeah, he seems just like such an amazing, a truly like enlightened person.
Mm. And it's funny to hear about him sort of sitting in those long silence, the pregnant pause. I'm imagining everyone is like squirming and he's like just present in his own
Yeah,
thing.
yeah, you kind of get used to it, but yeah, I do think at first when people are like, "What's going on? Why is he just sitting there?" Yeah, I think when people sort of have this sort of like energy, like you can really sense it.
Hmm.
And so yeah, it's really yeah, he's a great person to watch if you get a chance. I think we're hopefully seeing him again in October. So yeah.
So this particular book, it focuses on the now. Can you describe what this means?
Yeah, I mean, I would say just, the present moment, what is happening right now, and the thing that, often takes us away from, what he referred to as the now are like our thoughts. And so when we're consumed by our thoughts, we're not being present, we're not in the now. And by kind of coming into our body, coming into that moment, we're able to kind of be more present and kind of deal with the things that come up in our life in a more kind of conscious way.
Do you think that this book has helped change your perception of time in the present moment?
Yes. I think it's changed it honestly. One of the things he talks about a lot is, if there's something you can do to change, he refers to like your life situation. It's like if there's something you can do, you should do it. And if there's not something you can do, you shouldn't just ruminate on it. And I think that's something that really like resonates with me. So if I'm on vacation and I'm worrying about my water heater leaking, there's probably nothing I can do in that moment, so I should just come back and enjoy the vacation instead of like ruminating about this thing that I can't do anything about in the moment. And so that's something I'm always really trying to work through. If I need to make a phone call, then I can just make the phone call and not think about it. But if there's nothing you can do, there's no point. So much of our suffering comes from just this overthinking and just this worrying, and it doesn't actually fix anything. It really takes us out of what we're doing. So that's a big one for me.
Mm. Like it sounds like you really are practice. It's a practice, right? And practice makes progress. So that's cool to hear that you implemented it or attempted to kind of notice when you're being pulled out of the moment and bringing yourself back.
When I was on this retreat, there was like this bulletin board, and people could put up little notes if you wanted to like connect with someone. And so I put one up like, hey, are there any therapists here? I'm really interested in working these teachings into my own therapy practice. And I met up with some of them. There were some, and it seemed to me like the modality most connected to these teachings is ACT, or acceptance and commitment therapy. And I've taught a class on ACT. A lot of it is like Russ Harris is a big teacher, and he has this whole thing about dropping anchor, which is like noticing your thoughts, labeling them, and then coming into your body and coming into the space. And so I do think it pairs really well with ACT. And so I do think the other part of ACT is like moving towards your values, which is something I think is really important too. But yeah, it's interesting. I think it's aligned with a lot of therapeutic approaches already. I mean, this idea of just like labeling our thoughts before we kind of get totally identified with them and like can't even tell we're thinking.
Hmm. Like even as you were speaking, when you said drop anchor, I could feel like I took a deep breath and like felt myself like take my seat for a moment too. So it's
Yeah.
interesting. Some of these words I think we really resonate just naturally. And that's cool. Like as you said, I was like, oh, okay, like I'm here. I'm here.
Yeah,
Um,
exactly. And it's so, yeah. And it's like, that's like, it's like any of the stuff. It's like a practice. It's like you come
mhm.
back to it, and it's like, Eckhart Tolle might be present all the time. He seems kind of like he is, but I think that he's like a very rare case. And so for us, it's like you get caught up in your thoughts, and then you come back into your body, come back into space. And it's just like this practice of just doing it over and over.
I think getting caught up in thoughts is an experience that many, can relate to. Do you have any advice for people that want to get out of their head and more into their body?
He talks about this a lot, is, thinking is not like a bad thing, right? Like thinking is super important in order for us to get things done, like plan things, accomplish things. Like we have to think. I think we don't always have to be thinking. So I think using it strategically can be good. And then I think dropping anchor is really good. I think any embodied practice like yoga or walking, something I've been working on a lot is I like love listening to podcasts. So I will like have a podcast on all the time if I'm washing the dishes, if I'm vacuuming, if I'm going for a walk. And so I'm actually trying to, and my wife has been encouraging me to do this, is like do that less and just kind of be more present, and I think that's been really helpful for me. So if you're washing the dishes, maybe just focusing on the dish, like focusing on these tasks instead of always having this kind of distraction in the background, because I think that's not exactly thinking, but it is kind of taking you out of what you're doing. So I think being more kind of deliberate can be a good way to kind of also bring yourself into your body in the present moment.
It sounds so simple. I'm somatically trained as a therapist, so I studied somatic psychotherapy, and it still isn't as accessible for me as I feel like it should be as someone
Hmm.
who feels like I'm, pretty embodied and like that's how I focus working with people. And so it's one of those things that like admittedly is even hard to like translate into the therapy space with people and you're like just feel your toes, right? Like there is I think a hesitation. Like we are so used to living up here that even in like a safe space it is such a practice.
Yeah,
Um,
and I think a lot of us are just really kind of disconnected from our bodies. And I remember being in therapy a long time ago, and my therapist being like, "Where do you feel that?" And I'm like, "Well, what do you mean?" And they're like, "Do you feel it in your chest?" I was like, "I don't feel this emotion in my body." It's like I think we can feel really disconnected, and I think you're right. I think a lot of so much is happening in our heads that it's finding ways to connect to the rest of it is really important.
mhm.
I still struggle with that when my therapist asks me. I'm like, I have no idea. Like it's
I
hard
know,
to
I
try
know.
and like do the register of yourself.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, because we're not taught these things, right? And it's to move around embodied and not just sort of in our brain would be sort of against pushing things forward and participating in capitalism and all the things like
Yep.
it benefits us to be sort of like disembodied, I would say. Benefits
Yeah.
the world,
It
society.
Yeah.
also it also feels like there should be a more complicated answer than just being present. Like, it feels like it should be harder than like the simple way to do it. So sometimes you can kind of reject it because you're like, that's too easy, or I don't know.
Well, it's really interesting because I also work, with mindfulness techniques in my therapy practice, and it's so funny, so many people are like, "Oh, I can't meditate because like I just think too much." Like, right, like that's like everyone feels like it feels like there's something wrong with you or like these thoughts are coming in and you can't control them. And I think learning that like kind of everyone feels that way can be really reassuring and like no one is expecting you to be totally perfect. The goal of meditation is not to not have any thoughts. It's right. It's like to have the thought and then like come back to the present and then have the thought. And so I think viewing this as like a practice is a lot better than like trying to achieve some goal of like being perfect at it.
This book has been around for a while, and like I said, it's sort of a classic, and there are some critiques about this book, one being that it's like overly simplistic, or there's like the spiritual bypassing aspect to it. Do you have any thoughts on this?
Yeah, I mean, you're right. It's I don't know how many millions of copies it sold, but obviously, like Oprah, I think was the person who really introduced him, Eckhart Tolle, to the world, and obviously that's a huge scale. I get a lot of critiques of my own podcast, and it's like a much smaller scale, so I think there's like critique no matter what you're kind of putting out into the world. But I think you're right. I think the ideas are really simple, but I think that's kind of what makes it effective. And I think we tend to make things really complicated or think the solutions are much more complex than they are. And I think he's drawing on kind of a lot of ancient wisdom in these books too. If you see him speak, he's quoting, I don't know, a lot of like Greek thinkers. Like I think, I would say, he's not necessarily saying like he came up with these ideas. I think he just has this really effective way of kind of explaining them. And the book is kind of set up in an interesting way where it's almost like he's answering questions. You know what I mean? It's not really written in like a standard kind of narrative except the beginning part where he's talking about his own waking up on this park bench and kind of yeah, I do think it's simple, but to me, I think that's why it's so effective. And I think it's simple to explain and not so simple to be present all the time in practice too, right?
Mm-hmm.
I think it's helped me a lot as a therapist because it's really helped my kind of active listening and trying to be present and listen to what the other person's saying instead of when my client starts talking that I'm thinking how I'm going to respond and I'm not really listening to what they're saying, and that the more present you can be, like I feel like the better therapist I can be, or the better partner, or the better friend, or anything like that.
As you're speaking, it's making me imagine, having been broadcasted on Oprah, and then there's a lot that's like sort of hinging on this being the book that's changing people's lives. And like we say, we're not experts on all these topics. We're discussing topics and learning alongside other people with them. And yeah, I just think it's interesting to think about putting like there's so much hinging on this being something that's life changing for everyone. And if it's not for you, then that's okay too.
Yes, totally. And if it's not for you, that's like now, like some ideas resonate with you now, some ideas like 5 years from now, maybe you pick it up again. Not everything is going to resonate with everyone at that time, but you never know when things will sort of connect. And yeah, it might not be for everyone. Other people may connect with other ideas, and that's totally fine too. It's like this is just something that for me is has been really powerful.
Mm.
There was a chapter on enlightened relationships that sort of jumped out at me just because of the two book picks and your experience. And I was wondering if you thought that this concept was something that could help musicians and bands work together in a better way.
Yeah, absolutely. So much of what we talk about in therapy is like what we can and can't control. And like the main thing we can't control is other people. And so I think that's like a good thing to keep in mind with, enlightened relationship is like how can you bring yourself into the relationship? Something else he talks about a lot is this idea of like a high quality no. And so it's like how can I think that's really important is like learning how to say no in relationships in that kind of a way, in a high quality way, not a resentful way, not a way where you're like building up this animosity that's going to explode because the other concept he talks about a lot is the pain body. Um, and you sense it like if you see someone who has that kind of energy, it can like spread to other people and this kind of energetic kind of anger. And so how do you soothe someone else's pain body, and how do you not match someone's energy when things get heightened, and kind of keep that presence, and not feed into that energy and escalate things. And so I think this can come up a lot in bands, especially creative collaborations. I think it can come up even just getting an angry email from someone and you have that urge to just respond right away. And I think just like taking that 5 minutes to just like come into your body and not respond immediately, can you come back to like, oh, this wasn't really that big of a deal. Like, why was I so mad about this? But once you sent the email, then then they're matching it. And so I think it's the same with bands. I think you're having a disagreement. How do you maybe just like slow things down and explain things in a way without the reactivity? And the reactivity really is like defensiveness and the ego, and it's really responding without taking that minute to think. And so I think that's really where you can kind of work on the relationships.
Yeah, I think that's good advice always to not be reactive, especially with the angry email. I'm like, oh, I feel so seen.
Yeah, sometimes you can like draft it up and not send it, like just like write it out, and
Yeah.
that it almost like gets it out of your body and then just delete it or something. I think that can be good too.
Or I'll like sit on something and be like, oh, that made me mad, and then wait and go back and read it. And I'd be like, actually, I was just inferring all this stuff that
Yep.
isn't in the email at all. And then you can reply
Yes.
in a more grown up manner.
Yeah. Yeah. It's tough. It's tough.
But it sounds like you have got a lot from this book, and it has influenced the work that you're doing with clients. Is there anything else that you would hope that a reader would take away from it?
I think, it's interesting that he doesn't really talk a lot specifically about this idea of meditation. He's more about coming into the present moment, whatever you're doing. And I think that can be really helpful to people who are like, I don't have time. I don't want to just like sit on a cushion. I don't, I think this idea that this is like the present moment is always accessible to you can be really kind of open it up. So whatever you're doing, just trying to like come into your body, take a couple of deep breaths, that can really help your mental health, help you kind of focus on the things that are important to you. So yeah, you don't need any like special tools or to set aside 20 minutes. Just you can come into it wherever you are. So I think that's really, something that is important, for people to know.
That's such an important takeaway because I think people feel intimidated by this idea of meditation and having to do this specific seated experience. And it's like, no, just notice what you're doing and the things that you're actually touching and going on a walk and like hearing the birds, right? Like that's all being in the now.
Yeah, exactly. And I think obviously like technology, all of this stuff is constantly now like competing with our attention, and we have our phones and they're so easy. To me, like my phone is the main thing that takes me out of the now. It's like I pick it up to check my email and then it's like 45 minutes later and I'm like, what happened? And so I think, yeah, if it helps you like putting some kind of tracking on how much you're using it or limits on apps, like for me, it's like having some kind of safety rails in place, to help you when you're getting off track, to kind of not get kind of totally consumed by this technology that can really kind of like take us away from that.
It's so real. I think I need like a physical zap
I know. I know.
to pull me off of it. Sometimes my nervous system will do that if I'm in that sort of mindless, I'll like catch myself and then I'll like be like, "Ugh," I'll like throw. It's very interesting, but I'm like, I need something stronger to get me out of that.
And it's like, something, I've studied this a lot too. And, the gist of like, I don't know, like Johan Hari, he wrote a great book, Stolen Focus. And his take is like really like this isn't your fault. Like it's like very, very smart people who understand how your brain works have designed this in order to take your attention. It's not your fault, but how do you kind of work with it so you don't kind of like constantly kind of feed into it.
Yeah, the last thing I need in that step is then to shame myself further.
Exactly, exactly. Yeah, because then you do it, then you feel bad about yourself, then you're like, oh, what's the point? Yeah, so exactly. So not shame yourself. It's not your fault, but how can you kind of work with it? Yeah, exactly.
I'm
That's a really
just
good point.
I'm just going to imagine Robin Williams hugging me, saying it's not my fault every time I get too overwhelmed with my phone.
Perfect. That sounds
That'll be
great.
my visual. All right, let's go into the second book, the book of your choosing, which was Band People by Franz Nicolay. Can you tell us why did you pick this book?
So Franz is someone I've known a long time. You know, he's played in bands, World Inferno Friendship Society, The Hold Steady. So he's, connected to music, obviously. But he's, also wrote a novel. He's written a couple books about his. So he's just someone who I really admire, who's really smart. And I actually got to interview him recently at his house for my book because his book influenced me so well, and I felt like really did such a great job of talking about what it's like to be a working musician and the dynamics when it comes to money, communication, transparent, So I just kind of picked it up and was excited to read it. And to me, it was such a perfect balance of like kind of a trade book and an academic book. I think this book took him something like 6 or 7 years to write. And it's just super well researched. And he brings in a lot of ideas from outside of music when it comes to communication. And yeah, I just think it's a really fascinating book for people who might not understand what it's. I guess it's like people assume anyone in a band is like super rich and hasn't made and doesn't have any problems, and it really kind of pulls the curtain back. And not to say like it's terrible, but it's like a real hustle. And how do you kind of cope with that?
Yeah, and I think sometimes there's a presumption as well that people only get into bands to become rich and famous.
Yes.
So it's a kind of shining a light on like just working musicians as well. But let's roll it back a little bit to say, who are the band people that Franz is writing about?
So there's like a wide range. I would say it's generally like people in his kind of stratosphere. And so he kind of the Hold Steady is kind of like they're a rock band, I guess, but they're kind of part of that kind of punk, kind of indie, hardcore world. So I would say, Benny Horowitz from the Gaslight Anthem is in there. He's someone I hosted a podcast with going off track for a long time. He still does it with our producer, Brad. Josh Freese, who is just, was in the news a lot for leaving the Foo Fighters. And then honestly, a lot of musicians that I kind of knew, or a lot of musicians I didn't know, who were more almost these not necessarily session players, but people who kind of fill in with different bands in this world and who are, yeah, essentially trying to make a living as musicians in a time when album sales are not something you can really depend on at all. Really, yeah, basically at all.
Yeah, it kind of talks a little bit about like I mean, in the beginning anyway, about how a working musician would have almost been considered a trade, which I
Hmm.
haven't put them together before, but of course it is because you're almost apprenticing as you're learning to like play your instrument and seeing it as a trade that may have even been unionized in certain places. So the book sort of poses the question around the balance of like music being a job, music being art, and the mix of both, and I guess how difficult it can be when uh, you're monetizing art. So I guess what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, so yeah, he talks about these session players, maybe in Nashville or these places that were kind of unionized and had these really good rates per session, and how that has kind of changed over the years. And I don't think that exists. And I think it's obviously a lot of it is tied into again to technology and people, not selling records and not getting those royalties. I think it's a really tough thing to do is to make a living doing any kind of art, but especially music. The people who want to do it, I think, are not doing it. Most of them are not doing it to get rich. I think they're doing it because they have this kind of inner thing, they're just compelled to do it. This is what they love. And so how do you navigate that? And I think it's just getting increasingly difficult to do. I just interviewed a band, or we had a band on our podcast. It's band Dury. They're like a brother and sister from Minneapolis, and they were able to sort of have this like viral hit get like a record deal. They're very creative. They know how to use TikTok. They're a little younger, and I do think it's possible to kind of market yourself that way without having a label or all these resources, which is really inspiring. But I think there's also just so many bands out there. It's very hard to make yourself stand out. So yeah, I think it's tough. I think it's tough, and there is no union, and there is no guarantees, and yeah, and I think COVID was obviously really, really tough for the whole touring industry. And I think, everyone's trying to kind of figure out what the landscape looks like now.
Yeah, it's tough. I think they talk a little bit about how you used to be able to make money gigging, whereas that's sort of harder now as well. And then, as we know, with like the online streaming, I just read that or listened to, I guess, that Mood Machine about Spotify and sort of eye-opening the idea of like, passive listeners versus active listeners and things.
Yep.
So I think it's tough now for musicians.
Yeah, it's really tough. And I think, yeah, I think it's just like a hustle. It's like anything else. It's like you have to constantly kind of be looking out for work and figuring out your schedule. And yeah, and I think Franz's book it does such a good job of talking about these people that have like a level of success, right? Like they're successful, they're able to support themselves, but they're not rich, and they're dealing with, a member of a band who gets publishing, and then the other members don't get publishing. And so like even within one unit, someone can be making a lot more money than the rest of the bands. And
Mhm.
then there's examples of bands like REM where they're splitting the publishing four ways, and they're able to stay together for like 40 years or something. So it's yeah, the way the business is set up and the dynamics and the personalities, I think, is something he explores really, really in a really nice way in the book.
Yeah, it kind of made me laugh a little bit about so many bands being like, well, like Radiohead do it great. We
Yeah,
can't all be
yeah.
like Radiohead and splitting it evenly like that.
Yes. Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. I mean, and there are these bands that, yeah, they're able to, like Radiohead, they're able to really commit to their art and still be incredibly successful. But I think that's, very rare.
And the format of the book is interesting because it's almost like an oral history, but not necessarily because there's Franz's writing within it as well. But it has a lot of great interviews and band stories, like you've mentioned some people already. But just wondering if there was any others that jumped out in particular to you. I'm a big Mike Watt fan. I just love the Minutemen and like the whole We Jam Kono concept and
Yes.
everything. So just always love when he pops up somewhere.
He pops up everywhere. I feel like
hmm
every like music documentary, he's like riding around in his van and they're like interviewing him.
Well, because he still does. I think I was listening to some or reading somewhere when he tours, because he toured recently, they still play every day. Like that's his whole concept of like, even in, I don't know how old he is now, but if it's a 30-day tour, it's 30 days nonstop. And I think
Wow.
somebody said to him kind of like, oh, it's so unfair you don't get a break. And he's like, no, no, this is how we do the tour. We tour and then it's over.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, I don't know. Yeah, he's great, of course. Yeah, and no one else is like jumping out at me specifically from the book, but I know what we emailed before this, and this idea that you had brought up, like this, there's a whole section on like being a good hang,
hmm
and I found like that to be really like this kind of unspoken thing that I never had really like read about so kind of explicitly, where people are like, yeah, there's a lot of really talented musicians, but you don't necessarily want to be around them every day for 3 months. And so I think, and you can't really change someone's personality. And
hmm
so I think this idea of people having like a good personality, being kind of courteous, can go a long way when it comes to like being able to work in this kind of environment. And you could be the best guitar player in the world, but no one's going to want to hire you if you're like difficult to be around.
Yeah, and I think maybe, especially with band people who are sort of not the invisible, but they're kind of the smaller, less public facing. And because you kind of think about a tour and maybe your mind goes to this giant stadium tour. But for example, I went to a gig last night. I went to see Samantha Crane, and she's like playing as a trio and had mentioned on stage that she has been touring since the end of May. And my friend there was just like, that's insane. Like, that's such a long time to be touring and just like three people in a van with their dog jumping around the place. So, yeah, it makes sense for it to be kind of this undefined, like, if you're not a good hang, yeah, if personalities clash, even if you're incredible, it won't work.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it can be really really tough. So I think that concept is really important. And just being, and a lot of the book too is like this idea of publishing. If you're playing something on a song, does that mean you're a writer? Like where does, or are you just playing in the background? Like where does that cross over? Because I think the money aspect can also be super divisive for a lot of bands, especially when you're not necessarily like a member, you're more of a touring person.
Yeah, and it's hard to talk about money too, right? You want to be so excited
Yes.
that you have this opportunity, whereas balancing that I also want to be paid for this
Yes.
opportunity.
Yeah. And then you hear these horror stories where someone's like, yeah, I advocated to get paid more and then I got fired. And like this person never talked to me again. It's like people are so weird about money, especially I think really successful artists can be. And so, yeah, it's a really tough thing to kind of navigate, but you also need to, yeah, be paid something you're worth. Otherwise, you're going to feel resentful.
I love this concept of the good hang because, to your point, I'm imagining there's personality, easy to get along with, courteous, all the things that you're mentioning, but also there's something in the dynamics there of it also meshing with the other personalities, right? Like if I were a musician thinking about like how I show up in a band or how I want to be in a band, like there's got to be a level of chemistry with all the personalities, right? So I just think this is such a cool concept to think about because yeah, you might be polite, but maybe that doesn't mesh with the other people. And there's a lot of dynamics there. So I imagine it feels hard to like define what a good hang actually is.
Yeah, I think so too. And I think it's like defining everyone's role. Different people gravitate towards taking different roles. Like, some like in my band, like a lot, I would like advance the shows. And so it's like I'd be dealing with the promoters, and then other people would be dealing more with getting the merch made. And it's like, people want to work on the things that they're good at, but you don't want one person taking on too much of the work, or they can kind of feel like they're not getting enough help. And so, yeah, I think this idea of the good hang is it's not something you can necessarily teach,
Mm.
but I think it has to be something where like these super successful musicians are getting a lot of these jobs not just because they're like amazing musicians, which I'm sure they are, but how do you deal with people? And also like the travel aspect too, right? Like I don't know if you've ever taken like a vacation with friends and you're like, wow, I thought this person was super easy to get along with, but actually like this is like a little, when people are out of their natural environment, sometimes you can see a different side of them, right? And so I think there's that aspect is happening like every day.
Totally. I think there's like some discourse on TikTok right now of the reasons why you're not invited to like a group trip, right?
Okay.
It's like it's interesting because it's like, yeah, there's so many little aspects that go into, making a trip or travel successful. And there are things that maybe sometimes aren't thought about, but it's cool because now we have you for bands to come to like learn these communication skills of I know that I take this on, like I need more help with this, right?
Right.
Like there's such a need for this type of communication because a lot of times people take on labor without having it explicitly stated and then they feel resentful.
Absolutely. Yeah. And people might not even know, or people, yeah. I mean, so I think having that kind of communication of being like, hey, I feel like overwhelmed. Can someone help me with this? It's really, the more like kind of steam you can kind of like let out in these small doses, the less it's going to just build up. And then someone says something small to you and you just explode. And,
Mhm.
then the tour is canceled and then everyone's out of work and more stressed out. Right. So, yeah.
Mhm. And
And
then you throw like toxic masculinity in there and it's
yeah, I was
Yeah.
just gonna say there's a section on where it talks about like it's primarily male musicians and kind of the experience about female musicians in the space as well. So I like that they touched on that piece too.
Mhm. Yeah. I think that's really important to be addressed. And I think, yeah, it's no secret like men are just not great at communicating. I think especially young men. I think especially young men in bands. And so I think it's like can be this kind of perfect storm of like, you introduce substances, you introduce these kind of pressures, and yeah, it can be especially volatile.
it seems like the music industry has changed a lot. And you even mentioned artists getting started or trying things on TikTok. Like, what advice would you give to a musician today that's trying to navigate the industry?
Yeah, it's tough. I mean, I think it's a lot different, even when I was kind of starting out, the early 2000s, like I would be like, "You put your band on MySpace." And, it's like obviously that's not going to work these days. I think just, having like realistic expectations, trying to kind of be patient, trying to get there's so many ways to get your music out there now. So just trying to figure out, how to use these social media or these platforms in order to get it out there. I don't think touring is necessarily as important as it was when we were starting out. Like I remember we were playing all these like small towns, and now I think you can really kind of focus on these bigger places and try to get your music out that way. So the answer is like, I don't really know. But I think just being able to use technology without letting it kind of take over and finding that balance between live performance and technology is a way to get the music out there, I guess.
Is there a sense of community, do you think? Because I know I work with indie authors, and I mean, I just like to compare it to indie musicians just because I listen to a lot of indie musicians. And part of, you're very kind of siloed into this place where you're doing, especially writing, you're doing it on your own. And the community is a huge aspect of like helping support authors through that process. I'm just wondering, do you think nowadays, as social media is like so prevalent, has that helped like a community, or is it still there's sometimes like an old-fashioned like musician rivalry aspect where you're not going to help that band, but
Right.
it seems a bit more
I
collaborative now, but I don't know.
Yeah, I don't think there is a sense of like geographic community in the same way there used to be. Like I was just listening to this podcast with Kevin Martin, the singer of Candlebox, on Turned Out a Punk, where they're talking about like the Seattle like grunge scene in the 90s and sort of this community. And obviously this was like a very kind of like self-destructive community in a lot of ways, but it's also like all of this amazing art came out of this one super small geographic area. And I don't get the sense that communities happen in that way. Like I don't think there would be like a sound from a certain region because things are so kind of like in the cloud now. So I think less geographic community, but I do think people are able to find other people with similar interests and support each other through the technology. So I think in some ways there can be a community, and I do think, there's been this big resurgence in like hardcore music. Like hardcore music is like with bands like Turnstile and Knocked Loose. Hardcore music is like more mainstream popular now than it ever was, throughout my life. So I think people are able to get into this music and connect and go to these shows and find each other in an easier way. It's not just like the like two other weird kids at your school like it was when I was growing up. So I think in some ways there can be that community support, but I don't think it's as based in kind of like physical geography as it used to be.
It's a great podcast. Turned Out a Punk. I listened to that as well. He's also in Toronto.
Oh yeah, Damien's
Yeah.
amazing. Yeah, Vanessa and I did it recently, and I've been on the podcast, and he's like knows everything about punk. It's a really great. I could not believe how much this guy from Candlebox knew about punk rock. It was so surprising to me. But yeah, Damien is amazing. Yes.
This is a side note, but how is it doing a podcast with your sister, especially one that has like a platform from SNL?
Yeah, it's been really fun. We've worked together. We when she was in Chicago before she was on SNL, she used to always roast my bands. Like I would have her, she was just starting out in comedy. So it always, when we'd play in Chicago, we would have her come up and kind of like roast us and make fun of the audience. And it was always really fun. And then when she moved to New York, I was living there. And so we actually had a web series for a few years called Sound Advice, where she played this kind of media coach character and kind of gave bands bad advice. And we were able to, we did one with Drake, we did one with NoFX, I don't know, we had all kinds of Weird Al, all kinds of people on it. And so when I moved out to Western Mass, we kind of wanted to find a new thing to work on. And so the podcast we've done it for 3 or 4 years. It's really fun. It gives us a chance to kind of like catch up every week. And it really came about super organically. Like I would always text her, like, do you remember this thing? Like, do you remember this from when we were kids? And so now like, that will just be the topic of a podcast, and so we'll just talk about it and get into the history and have a guest. So yeah, it's been really fun to do the podcast with Vanessa.
It's fun to hear about all the things that you have such a diverse portfolio, I don't know, of things that you're interested in. So it's like, thanks for sharing all those aspects today. And also like, I really enjoyed this conversation and hearing about your work. And as we were talking, I was like, this makes so much sense that like, this is a need for, a niche in mental health. And it's cool. Like, I think your clients and people that work with you are really lucky to have you. Where can people find you online if they're interested in working with you or any of the things that we talked about today?
Yeah, thank you so much for that. Yeah, just my name, jonahbayer.com, Bayer. That has really everything there. That has info about my therapy practice, links to my Psychology Today page. It also has stuff about the coaching program, my writing work, my music. So it's all there. All the links are there. So just if you go to, I'm not really on social media, but if you go to jonahbayer.com, that's probably the best way to learn more.
And when's your book coming out again?
The book is scheduled for April 2027.
All right, I'll keep an eye out for it. I'm excited
So
to read
yeah,
that.
keep an eye out. Yeah, maybe we can come back when it gets closer.
Yeah.
But yeah, I'm hoping April 2027. It's about 50% of the way written, so I'm trying to kind of power through it now.
Get your 500 words a day. You can do it.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, thanks so much for chatting with us. This has been great.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me on. I really am excited to listen to more episodes of the podcast.
Thanks for listening to Books from Your Therapist. If you're interested in the books we talked about, we'll include links in our show notes. If you'd like to reach out to us with your own recommendations or are a mental health practitioner interested in coming on to share, you can email us at booksfromyourtherapist@gmail.com. And follow us on socials. We are at Books From Your Therapist on Instagram, Threads, and TikTok. And if you'd like, you can follow me on Substack. I'm at Tara Kremen. And if you're in California and interested in working with Amanda, you can find her at amandathrockmorton.com.
Happy being in the present moment.
Happy enjoying the now and then coming back again to the now. I don't know. I didn't think of a good one. I was not prepared.